Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Climate Curious, recorded at TED24, we're asking, why are we so bad at reporting on and celebrating the climate wins? Economist and journalist Angus Hervey is on a mission to show that progress is not just possible, but is already happening all around us. Over to Angus to learn more. And remember, stay curious. I'm super excited to be here with economist and journalist Angus Hervey, who's founder of Fix the News. And so first, let me ask you, tell me about your work. Like, what is Fix the News? And tell me a little bit about how you got into it.
Fix the News is a very, very, very small media publication. It's essentially a newsletter. And we widely regarded as the most authoritative source and wide-ranging source on the internet of stories of progress from around the world. We publish once a week. And we share all of the stories of the incredible things that are happening around the world that you never hear in most mainstream news organizations.
As, I guess, a journalist, why tell these stories?
It's an attempt to bring back balance by being wildly unbalanced.
Okay, say more about that. I love it.
My belief, and I think this is borne out in study after study, is that the biggest problem with the news today isn't filter bubbles or partisan conflict or even ideology or the rise in opinion-based writing. I think those are all issues, but I think the biggest issue in journalism today is the bad news bubble. That journalism is so heavily predisposed towards telling stories of death, destruction, and disaster that it leaves almost no room for any stories of progress. And Fix the News was founded on a belief that we need to be telling stories of progress as well. And contained within that is the idea that it's not about saying, it's not an attempt to cancel out or balance the bad news. It's just to say these stories are happening too.
Right.
And we need to include them in our analysis.
So for listeners, I think the feeling of, when it comes to climate, that things are not going well is definitely one they're going to be picking up in the news, but also from the UN Secretary General to different kind of activists. And that is part of the story. But as you're saying, it's not the whole picture. So I'm wondering if you could give us some of the stories of progress around climate that have really captured your attention recently.
I think maybe it's worth rewinding a little bit just to get a bit more context on where things are at with the climate debate.
Okay,
right now.
yeah, I love it. So
I've been following climate and specifically energy, because energy, of course, is not the only solution, but it's one of the most important solutions to the climate crisis, the clean energy transition. We have to reduce emissions, but we also have to build out a new energy system. And I think the climate debate's in this very interesting point right now where, for the general public and most people who are coming to the climate debate really for the first time, I've never seen more fear than there is right now, for very good reasons. And yet for those of us who've been following this for a decade or longer, I have never seen so much hope.
I completely agree.
And I think that's a really interesting disconnect, where the people who know most about the subject are so incredibly excited about how fast the clean energy transition is moving, and that it's progressing faster than anyone ever anticipated, and that we're starting to bend the curve, and that our projections now are looking better and better by the year. And yet the general conversation it's just falling apart.
One of my favorite graphs is the Bloomberg price of solar graph, that every year they had to change it because they could not believe it was moving so fast. And I completely resonate with this. I came into climate about 3.5 years ago from the human rights field. And before coming into really deep diving into this work, felt very hopeless, felt very much like things were, that sense of fear. And now having been able to see firsthand the incredible people working on this and the progress being made, have never felt so hopeful. Yeah. And that disconnect is really interesting. And I'm curious as to whether you think this is the role that the media plays in fueling that fear.
No, I'm not sure it's a media problem.
Okay.
I think it's a mischaracterization problem.
Okay, say more about that.
When people think about climate change, it's talked about all the time, of course, as climate change is talked about as a global problem.
Right.
Climate change is global. It's a global problem. We as a species have to step up globally to fix it. Climate change is not a global problem. Climate change is a there are between China, India, United States, and the European Union. That's around 60 to 70% of global carbon emissions. And out of those four, carbon emissions are now actually falling in the European Union and the United States. So they're already trending downwards. China's carbon emissions, the IEA published a graph last year showing that China's carbon emissions are something like twice as big as the United States. So essentially right now, climate change is basically a China problem with a little bit of India and the United States thrown in.
As long as European Union and the US stay on the same trajectory.
And they will. The European Union carbon emissions fell by their largest amount ever in 2023. US emissions are trending downwards. They can go faster, but we're going down for the European Union and America. In advanced economies last year, carbon emissions declined back to the level of 50 years ago.
Okay.
So we're good. Advanced economies, we're doing it.
Right. Which is definitely, even for me, feels like, really?
Yeah, we're doing it. In advanced economy, we've not solved it, but now it's heading in the right direction. So now the big thing is China. What's going to happen in China? And China is really interesting because China's rollout of clean energy now is going faster than almost anyone understands. So last year, of course, record-setting deployment of solar, huge, most amount in human history. Analysts, by looking at what China did last year, are starting to say that it looks like Chinese carbon emissions might start falling as early as this year, 2024. First 2 months of 2024, China almost doubled its solar installations on 2023. So that acceleration that we saw last year has accelerated even further in 2024. And this is a story that is just not getting any traction whatsoever. So if you roll back to it and say, right, climate change is mostly a China problem, and in the country where that's causing the biggest problems, we've just had the greatest acceleration of solar deployment that we've ever seen in the first 2 months of 2024. I think that would create a completely different narrative about how we're tackling the crisis.
Let me ask you last question here. And is there a piece of data, a piece of news that you have heard in the last 12 months that surprised you, given that you're immersed in this?
Oh, there's just so many. The wonderful thing about looking for stories of progress on climate and clean energy is that there are just so many.
Right.
And they're so exciting.
I agree. You're the agreed audience.
But probably the story that I'm most excited about is just how geothermal is suddenly in the picture.
Yes.
That it was this sort of real dark horse of the kind of clean energy movement, and everyone's kind of stuck it in there with tidal energy or maybe something else. It was probably even more of a dark horse in tidal energy, if I'm honest. And then suddenly, in the last 12 months, thanks to Fervo and I think a couple other geothermal companies, they've sort of said, all right, let's take oil drilling techniques, let's improve them, let's have a crack at it. And just this extraordinary exponential increase in efficiency and what the results they're achieving. And then also, these are big ones. I think Fervo's now working on a 400 megawatt geothermal plant. Like that's a big plant.
It's not insignificant.
And I think when you start looking at the resource that we have in terms of geothermal heat, you start looking at the expertise that the oil and gas industry has in drilling holes into the ground, and you put all those things together, it just seems like an extremely exciting prospect. And I'm very excited about where geothermal, I think, is going to be in 5 years' time.
Well, that's very exciting. I'm kind of hoping that we get to check in with you in like a year again and see where that's gone. Because as you said, so much of this is exponential that a year can actually make a really big difference.
Yeah. So I'm happy to make a prediction.
Okay. Yes. Great. And we can come back to you.
I'm going to put myself I'm going to go really out on the line here. By the time you speak to me next time in April 2025, I'm willing to bet that we will have seen carbon emissions start declining for the first time.
Across the board.
In 2024, we're going to see global carbon emissions decline for the first time.
Okay. This is a bet I'm happy to take. I actually want you to. I want you to win. I don't know why I'm saying happy. I'm going to take it, but I want you to. I want you to be right.
I think we're going to be sitting here in a year's time, and I'm going to say to you, we did it. We have. It's started going down. We've got there way earlier than we thought.
I am very excited that you made that prediction. I'm very excited to come back to you in a year and hopefully prove you right, because that would be. Wouldn't that just feel like it just almost feels like too good to be true. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us and for making this prediction.
Thanks for listening to this Quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time.
Stay curious.